Margaret Thompson pushed through the crowded garage, her heart heavy with memories. The morning sun cast long shadows across tables filled with her grandfather's belongings. 3 months had passed since Robert Thompson died peacefully in his sleep. But Margaret still felt the sharp sting of loss every time she saw his favorite coffee mug or worn leather chair. The family had agreed to hold an estate sale. They needed to clear out his small house on Maple Street before the new owners took possession. Margaret watched strangers rifle through boxes of books, old tools, and kitchen items. Each person who picked up something that belonged to her grandfather felt like they were taking away pieces of her childhood. Her cousin Jake stood near the front table, handling the money and chatting with buyers. He seemed comfortable with the whole process, treating it like any other yard sale. Margaret envied his ability to stay detached. For her, every item held a story. Every object connected to Sunday dinners and quiet evenings when Grandpa Robert would tell her stories about his younger days. A middle-aged woman examined a set of dishes, turning each plate over to check for chips. She placed them back down with a disappointed shake of her head. An older man in a baseball cap sorted through boxes of tools, testing the weight of each hammer and screwdriver. Children followed their parents around, touching everything within reach until their mothers pulled them away. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the chaos. She walked to the back corner of the garage where fewer people wandered. Behind stacks of old photo albums and dusty Christmas decorations, she noticed a small wooden box she had never seen before. The box was plain and simple, made of dark wood that had aged to a deep brown color. She pulled the box from its hiding spot and wiped away the dust with her sleeve. The wood felt smooth under her fingers, worn by years of handling. There was no lock, just a simple brass latch that opened with a gentle click. Inside, wrapped in faded purple velvet, lay what appeared to be an ordinary black watch. Margaret lifted the watch carefully from its cloth wrapping. It was heavier than she expected, with a solid weight that felt substantial in her palm. The face was scratched and showed signs of wear. The black bezel around the edge had faded in places, and the metal band looked tarnished with age. Small scratches covered the crystal face, making it difficult to read the numbers clearly. She turned the watch over in her hands, examining it from different angles. The back was engraved with words she could barely make out through the scratches and wear. It looked like it might say something about the Navy, but she could not be sure. The band was made of metal links that had loosened with time, and several links showed dents and scrapes. A dealer in an expensive suit walked past and glanced at the watch in her hands. He barely paused before continuing on, clearly unimpressed by what he saw. Another woman stopped and asked to see it, but after holding it for just a few seconds, she handed it back with a polite smile and moved away. A young man collecting vintage items took a quick look and shrugged, saying it was probably not worth much. Margaret felt a strange connection to the old timepiece. Perhaps it was because everyone else seemed to dismiss it so easily. Or maybe it reminded her of her grandfather himself. Quiet and unassuming, but somehow special in ways that others might not notice right away. Jake wandered over and saw her holding the watch. He laughed and shook his head. "Seriously, Maggie, you're going to buy that old thing? Grandpa probably picked it up at a pawn shop 20 years ago. It looks like it barely works." Margaret ignored her cousin's comments and looked more closely at the watch face. The hand still moved, though the second hand seemed to stick occasionally before jumping forward. The numbers around the edge were simple and clean, even though they were difficult to see through the scratched crystal. She had no idea what brand it was or when it might have been made. The only thing she could tell for certain was that it had been worn regularly by someone who worked with their hands. The scratches and dents told the story of a life filled with activity and purpose. A price tag hung from the band, written in Jake's messy handwriting. $15. Margaret almost smiled at the low price. Everything else at the sale had been carefully researched and priced according to its potential value. This watch had been dismissed as worthless, something to sell quickly just to get it out of the way. An elderly woman standing nearby noticed Margaret examining the watch. She leaned closer to her companion and whispered loud enough for Margaret to hear. "Young people these days waste their money on the strangest things. That old watch probably hasn't worked properly in years." The comment stung, but it also made Margaret more determined to buy the watch. She had learned from her grandfather that sometimes the things other people overlooked were the most valuable of all. Not valuable in terms of money, but valuable in ways that could not be measured or priced. Margaret walked to the front table where Jake was making change for a customer. She held up the watch and placed $15 on the table. Jake looked surprised but took her money without argument. As he handed her the receipt, he said, "I hope you're not expecting it to be worth anything. But hey, if it makes you happy, that's what matters." She tucked the watch carefully into her purse, wrapping it back in the purple velvet cloth. As she walked to her car, Margaret felt like she was carrying a small piece of her grandfather with her. She had no idea about its history or value, but something told her this old watch had stories to tell. The estate sale continued around her, but Margaret no longer felt sad about watching strangers take away her grandfather's possessions. She had found something that felt important, something that connected her to the quiet man who had raised her with patience and love. The watch might not look like much to other people, but to her it was perfect. As she drove home, the watch sat safely in her purse, beginning a journey that would soon reveal secrets no one in the family had ever imagined. 2 weeks passed before Margaret finally decided to learn more about her grandfather's watch. She had kept it on her nightstand, picking it up each morning and evening, turning it over in her hands like a puzzle she could not solve. The scratched engravings on the back continued to intrigue her, but she could not make out the complete words no matter how hard she tried. Margaret remembered hearing about Hammond's antiques and appraisals from a friend who had inherited some jewelry. The shop was located downtown on Elm Street, tucked between a coffee shop and a used bookstore. Robert Hammond had owned the business for over 30 years and was known throughout the city for his honest evaluations and fair dealing. On a quiet Tuesday morning, Margaret parked outside the small shop. The front window displayed an assortment of old furniture, vintage jewelry, and collectible items. A hand-painted sign above the door read, "Hammond's Antiques, Honest Appraisals since 1992. The bell above the door chimed softly as she entered. The shop smelled of old wood and furniture polish. Shelves lined every wall, filled with china sets, silver serving pieces, and antique clocks. Glass cases held jewelry, coins, and small valuable items. The wooden floors creaked softly under her feet as she approached the counter. Robert Hammond looked up from a ledger he was writing in. He was a thin man in his 60s with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. His sleeves were rolled up and his hands showed the calluses of someone who worked with old items every day. He smiled warmly as Margaret approached. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" Hammond asked, setting down his pen and giving her his full attention. Margaret pulled the watch from her purse, still wrapped in the purple velvet cloth. "I found this among my grandfather's things. I was hoping you could tell me something about it. Maybe what it's worth or when it was made." Hammond nodded and gestured to a stool beside the counter. "Of course. Let me take a look." His tone was friendly but professional, the voice of someone who had examined thousands of items over the years. Margaret unwrapped the watch and placed it on the counter. Hammond glanced at it briefly and reached for a standard appraisal form. "Probably a watch from the 70s or 80s, he said casually, pulling a magnifying glass from a drawer. "Most of these older pieces are worth about $20 to $30 depending on the condition." He picked up the watch and held it under a bright desk lamp. The routine nature of his movements suggested he had done this same examination countless times before. Margaret watched as he checked the crystal face, tested the crown that wound the watch, and examined the condition of the band. "The crystal has quite a few scratches," Hammond noted, making marks on his form. "The band shows wear but still functions properly. Let me check for any maker's marks or serial numbers." Hammond turned the watch over to examine the back. He adjusted his magnifying glass and leaned closer to read the engravings. Margaret watched his expression, hoping he might be able to decipher the words that had puzzled her for 2 weeks. As Hammond studied the back of the watch, something changed in his demeanor. His casual routine movements became more deliberate. His breathing seemed to slow and his grip on the watch became more careful. The confident expression on his face shifted to one of concentration, then surprise. Hammond murmured, adjusting his magnifying glass again. He moved the watch to catch the light from a different angle. His eyebrows drew together in a frown of concentration. Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Is something wrong?" Hammond did not answer immediately. He reached for a more powerful magnifying glass from a case behind the counter. This one had its own light built in, and he positioned it carefully over the watch back. His hands, Margaret noticed, had begun to tremble slightly. The seconds stretched into a full minute as Hammond continued his examination. He turned the watch over several times, looking at both sides with increasing intensity. His casual attitude had completely disappeared, replaced by the focused attention of someone who had discovered something unexpected. "Where exactly did you say you got this watch?" Hammond asked, his voice quieter than before. He looked up at Margaret with an expression she could not quite read. Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. "It was in my grandfather's things. We had an estate sale a couple of weeks ago, and I found it in an old wooden box in the back of his garage. Why, is there something unusual about it?" Hammond carefully set the watch down on a soft cloth and removed his glasses. He cleaned them slowly, clearly thinking about what he had discovered. When he put them back on, he looked directly at Margaret with serious eyes. "I think you should sit down," he said quietly. Margaret felt her heart rate increase. "What is it? What did you find?" Hammond picked up the watch again and pointed to the engravings on the back. "These markings here, they're not what I initially thought. This isn't just any old watch from a department store or pawn shop." He moved the magnifying glass so Margaret could look through it. "Can you see these letters here? And these numbers?" Margaret peered through the lens and could make out parts of words more clearly than she had before. She could see what looked like commander and some numbers, but the full inscription remained difficult to read. The engraving style, the type of metal used, the specific markings on the case, Hammond continued, his voice filled with disbelief. "This appears to be a genuine Rolex watch. But not just any Rolex." Margaret looked up from the magnifying glass, confused. "A Rolex? But it looks so old and beaten up. Are you sure?" Hammond nodded slowly. "The condition doesn't matter when it comes to certain types of watches. What matters is authenticity and provenance, and if I'm reading these engravings correctly, this watch has a very special history." The shop seemed to grow quieter around them. Even the street noise outside appeared to fade as Hammond continued his explanation. Margaret gripped the edge of the counter, sensing that her life was about to change in ways she could not yet imagine. "I need to examine this more carefully," Hammond said, his professional demeanor now mixed with excitement and concern. "Would you be willing to leave it with me for a few hours? I want to research these markings and confirm what I think I'm seeing." Margaret hesitated. She had only owned the watch for 2 weeks, but it already felt precious to her. The thought of leaving it with someone else even for a few hours made her uncomfortable. Hammond seemed to understand her reluctance. "I completely understand if you'd prefer to stay while I work. This is clearly important to you, but I think you're going to want to sit down when you hear what I have to tell you about this watch." Margaret sat down heavily on the wooden stool beside Hammond's counter. Her legs felt weak and her mind raced with possibilities. What could an old, scratched watch possibly reveal that would require her to sit down? She watched Hammond's face as he continued to examine the timepiece with intense concentration. Hammond reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick reference book. The cover was worn and the pages yellowed with age. He flipped through several sections before stopping at a page filled with photographs of different watches. His finger traced down the page until he found what he was looking for. "Here," Hammond said, turning the book toward Margaret. "This is what I believe you have." Margaret looked at the page and saw photographs of various black watches that looked similar to her grandfather's timepiece. The heading at the top of the page read, "Military. Issue Rolex Submariner watches 1950s, 1960s. Below, each photograph were detailed descriptions and estimated values that made. Margaret's eyes widened in shock. "Your grandfather's watch," Hammond continued, his voice steady but filled with amazement, "appears to be a genuine military-issue Rolex Submariner from the early 1960s. These watches were not sold to the public. They were given only to specific military personnel for special operations." Margaret stared at the book, trying to process what she was hearing. The numbers listed beside each watch photograph seemed impossible. $50,000, $75,000, $100,000 or more for watches in excellent condition. "But look at the condition of my grandfather's watch," Margaret said weakly. "It's all scratched up and worn. Surely that makes it worth much less." Hammond shook his head and smiled. "That's where you're wrong. The wear and scratches actually make it more valuable, not less. They prove the watch was actually used for its intended purpose. Collectors pay premium prices for watches that show evidence of real military service." He picked up the magnifying glass again, and positioned it over the back of the watch. Let me read you exactly what's engraved here. I can make it out more clearly now that I know what I'm looking for. Margaret leaned closer as Hammond slowly read the inscription aloud. Commander James Mitchell, USS Nautilus, Deep Sea Operations 1962 to 1965. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. Wait, that can't be right. My grandfather's name was Robert Thompson, not James Mitchell. Hammond looked up from the watch with sympathetic eyes. The watch belonged to Commander James Mitchell originally. Your grandfather must have acquired it somehow. But Margaret, do you understand what USS Nautilus means? Margaret shook her head. Her knowledge of military history was limited, and she had never heard the name before. The USS Nautilus was the world's first nuclear-powered submarine, Hammond explained, his voice filled with reverence. It was one of the most advanced and secret military vessels ever built. Any equipment associated with that submarine is considered incredibly valuable to collectors and museums. Margaret felt dizzy. The small garage sale purchase that had cost her $15 was potentially worth more money than she made in an entire year. But beyond the monetary value, questions flooded her mind about how her quiet grandfather had come to possess such an extraordinary item. Hammond continued reading from his reference book. Military-issue submariners from the Nautilus are among the rarest watches in the world. Only a small number were ever made, and even fewer survived. Most were returned to the military when sailors completed their service. So how did my grandfather end up with one? Margaret asked, though she suspected Hammond would not have the answer. That's the mystery, Hammond replied. Your grandfather would have had to serve on the Nautilus himself, or he would have had to acquire it from someone who did. Either way, there's a story here that goes far beyond just finding an old watch. Margaret thought about her grandfather's quiet life. He had worked at the local hardware store for 30 years after leaving the military. He never talked about his service time, always changing the subject when anyone asked about his younger days. Her grandmother had mentioned once that he served in the Navy, but she had assumed it was routine duty on regular ships. The serial number, Hammond said, making notes on a piece of paper. I can trace this to confirm authenticity. Military watches have very specific numbering systems, and if this is genuine, there will be records. He looked at Margaret seriously. But I have to warn you about something. If this watch is authentic, word will spread quickly through collector circles. You're going to receive offers to buy it. Some of those offers might be very aggressive. Margaret felt overwhelmed. She had come to the shop hoping to learn a simple fact about an old timepiece. Instead, she had discovered something that could change her entire financial situation. But more importantly, she had learned that her grandfather had secrets she never imagined. What should I do? She asked Hammond. First, let me authenticate it properly, he replied. I want to contact some experts and verify the serial number against military records. If it's genuine, you'll have several options. You could sell it to a private collector. You could auction it through a major house. You could even donate it to a military museum. Margaret nodded, though her mind felt foggy with shock. How long will authentication take? A few days, maybe a week, Hammond said. I know people who specialize in military timepieces. They can verify everything and give you a proper appraisal for insurance purposes. He carefully wrapped the watch back in its purple velvet cloth. Margaret, I want you to understand something. This watch represents a piece of American military history. Whether you decide to keep it or sell it, you're now the guardian of something truly special. Margaret left the shop in a daze. Her $15 purchase had transformed into something worth potentially $100,000 or more. But the money seemed secondary to the larger questions about her grandfather's past. As she drove home, Margaret realized that discovering the watch's value was only the beginning. The real mystery was how Robert Thompson, a quiet hardware store worker, had come to possess a watch that belonged to Commander James Mitchell of the USS Nautilus. She needed to learn more about her grandfather's military service. She needed to understand how he had acquired this extraordinary timepiece, and most importantly, she needed to discover what secrets he had kept hidden for over 50 years. The watch had opened a door to the past, and Margaret knew she had to walk through it, no matter what she might find on the other side. Margaret spent the rest of that week in a state of restless curiosity. Every quiet moment brought new questions about her grandfather's hidden past. She found herself staring at old family photographs looking for clues she might have missed. The man she had known as a gentle hardware store worker now seemed like a stranger with secrets. On Saturday morning, Margaret drove to her mother's house across town. Linda Thompson lived in the same neighborhood where Margaret had grown up, in a cozy ranch house filled with family memories. If anyone knew details about Grandpa Robert's military service, it would be his daughter. Margaret found her mother in the kitchen, preparing lunch and humming softly to herself. Linda looked up with a warm smile when Margaret entered, but her expression changed when she saw the serious look on her daughter's face. "Mom, I need to ask you about Grandpa's time in the Navy," Margaret said without preamble. Linda set down her knife and turned to face Margaret fully. "Why the sudden interest in his military service? You know he never liked talking about those days." Margaret pulled out her phone and showed her mother a photograph of the watch that Hammond had taken for authentication purposes. "Because I found this among his things and it turns out to be worth a lot of money. But more importantly, it raises questions about what he did during his service." Linda examined the photograph carefully, squinting at the small details. "I remember him wearing an old watch, but I never paid much attention to it. He had it for as long as I can remember." She looked up at Margaret with curiosity. "What kind of questions?" Margaret explained everything she had learned from Hammond about the USS Nautilus and military-issue watches. She watched her mother's expression change from casual interest to genuine surprise as the story unfolded. "The USS Nautilus," Linda repeated slowly. "I do remember him mentioning submarines a few times when I was young. But he always made it sound like routine duty. Nothing special or dangerous." Margaret felt a spark of hope. "What exactly did he say about submarines?" Linda sat down at the kitchen table and gestured for Margaret to join her. "It was so long ago. Your grandmother might have remembered better, but she's been gone for 8 years now." She paused, thinking. "I remember asking him once if he ever went underwater, and he said yes, but he changed the subject quickly." Margaret leaned forward eagerly. "What about after he got out of the military? Did he ever mention anyone named James Mitchell?" Linda shook her head. "That name doesn't sound familiar. But Margaret, you have to understand, your grandfather came home from the Navy and never wanted to talk about it. Your grandmother told me once that he had nightmares for the first few years after he got out, but he refused to see anyone about them." This information added another layer to the mystery. Margaret had never known her grandfather to have any kind of emotional problems. He had always been the steadiest, calmest person in their family. "Do you have any of his military papers?" Margaret asked. "Discharge documents, service records, anything like that?" Linda stood up and walked to a closet in the hallway. She returned with a small metal box that Margaret had seen many times but never examined closely. "He kept some papers in here, but I haven't looked through them in years." Together, they opened the box and sorted through its contents. Most items were routine documents like birth certificates and insurance papers. But at the bottom, Margaret found a folder containing her grandfather's military discharge papers. The official documents confirmed that Robert Thompson had served in the United States Navy from 1961 to 1966. His specialty was listed as deep-sea operations, and his final rank was Petty Officer First Class. But the most interesting detail was, under ships served, USS Nautilus SSN 571. Margaret felt her heart race as she read the confirmation that her grandfather had indeed served on the famous nuclear submarine. "Mom, look at this. He was on the Nautilus." Hammond was right about the connection. Linda read over Margaret's shoulder, her voice filled with wonder. "I had no idea. He never told us he served on such an important ship." She looked at her daughter with new understanding. That watch really did belong to someone from his submarine. Margaret continued searching through the papers and found something else interesting. There was a commendation letter dated 1963, praising Robert Thompson for exceptional service during classified operations. The letter was signed by the submarine's commanding officer, but many details were blacked out with heavy ink. "Classified operations," Margaret read aloud. "What do you think that means?" Linda shook her head. "I have no idea, but it sounds like whatever he did was more important than routine submarine duty." Margaret photographed all the relevant documents with her phone. She wanted to share them with Hammond and whoever he contacted for authentication. The papers proved her grandfather's connection to the USS Nautilus, but they also raised new questions about the nature of his service. After leaving her mother's house, Margaret stopped at the public library. She spent the afternoon researching the USS Nautilus online, learning about its historic missions and the role it played during the Cold War. The submarine had been involved in several secret operations beneath the Arctic ice. testing the limits of nuclear-powered underwater travel. One article mentioned that crew members on the most dangerous missions were issued special equipment, including watches designed to function under extreme pressure. The article specifically mentioned Rolex Submariner watches as standard equipment for deep-sea operations teams. Margaret felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together. Her grandfather had been part of these dangerous missions. He had been issued or acquired a watch from someone named Commander James Mitchell, and for over 50 years he had kept this entire chapter of his life secret from his family. But questions remained. If the watch belonged to Commander Mitchell, how had her grandfather ended up with it? Had they served together? Had something happened to the commander? And why had her grandfather never mentioned any of this, even to his own daughter? Margaret decided to take the next step in her investigation. She would contact military historians and see if she could learn more about the USS Nautilus missions in the early 1960s. She would try to find information about Commander James Mitchell, and his connection to her grandfather, Hammond, had warned her that authentication might take a week. Margaret realized that learning the full story behind the watch might take much longer, but she was determined to uncover the truth about her grandfather's hidden past, no matter how long it took or what secrets she might discover along the way. 3 days after Margaret discovered her grandfather's military records, Hammond called with unexpected news. The authentication had moved faster than anticipated, and the results were remarkable. The watch was not only genuine, but had attracted attention from some very important people. "Margaret, I need you to come to the shop immediately," Hammond said over the phone. His voice carried an urgency she had never heard before. "And bring those military documents you told me about. Something extraordinary is happening." When Margaret arrived at Hammond's shop, she found 2 people in business suits waiting inside. The woman was tall and professional-looking, with short gray hair and sharp eyes. The man was younger, carrying a leather briefcase and taking notes on a tablet computer. Hammond introduced them as Dr. Sarah Chen, a naval historian who specialized in Cold War submarine operations, and Marcus Webb, a military artifacts expert from Washington, D.C. Both had traveled specifically to examine her grandfather's watch after Hammond contacted them about the authentication. "Ms. Thompson," Dr. Chen said, extending her hand for a firm handshake. "Your grandfather's watch has created quite a stir in our community. We've been researching the USS Nautilus for years, and artifacts from that submarine are extremely rare." Margaret sat down as the expert spread documents across Hammond's counter. She could see copies of ship records, crew lists, and official reports that looked far more detailed than anything she had found in her grandfather's papers. "We've confirmed that the watch is authentic," Marcus Webb explained. "But more importantly, we've traced its history. Commander James Mitchell was indeed an officer on the USS Nautilus during some of its most classified missions." Dr. Chen opened a folder and pulled out a black and white photograph. "This is Commander Mitchell," she said, sliding the photo across the counter to Margaret. The photograph showed a young man in naval uniform, probably in his late 20s. He had dark hair, serious eyes, and the kind of confident expression that Margaret imagined all submarine officers needed to possess. Below the photo was a typed caption with his name, rank, and service dates. "Commander Mitchell disappeared during a mission in 1963, Dr. Chen continued. "His submarine returned safely, but he was listed as missing in action. The circumstances were classified, and his family was told only that he died in service to his country." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "What does this have to do with my grandfather?" Webb consulted his tablet before answering. "Your grandfather, Robert Thompson, was part of a special diving team on that same mission. According to the records we've uncovered, he was one of the last people to see Commander Mitchell alive." Margaret stared at the photograph of the young commander. Suddenly, the watch felt heavier with meaning. It was not just a valuable timepiece, but a memorial to someone who had died in service to his country. "We believe," Dr. Chen said carefully, "that your grandfather may have retrieved Commander Mitchell's watch during the mission. It was probably given to him by the commander himself, or he may have recovered it after the commander went missing." Hammond had been listening quietly, but now he spoke up. "Yesterday I received a phone call from the Pentagon. They want to examine the watch as part of their historical documentation project." Margaret's eyes widened. "The Pentagon?" Webb nodded. "Military historians are working to document artifacts from early nuclear submarine operations. Your watch represents a direct connection to one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War. Dr. Chen leaned forward earnestly. Ms. Thompson, we'd like to ask you to bring the watch to Washington, D.C. There are people there who served with your grandfather, people who might be able to fill in the missing pieces of this story. Margaret felt overwhelmed. What had started as a simple estate sale purchase was now involving military historians and Pentagon officials. Who exactly wants to see it? Webb checked his notes again. Colonel Patricia Hayes is coordinating the documentation project. She's arranged for you to meet with several veterans who served on nuclear submarines during that era. Some of them may have known your grandfather personally. The idea of traveling to Washington, D.C. and meeting with military officials seemed surreal to Margaret, but her curiosity about her grandfather's past had grown stronger with each new revelation. There's something else, Dr. Chen added. We've learned that there may be a surviving officer who was on that same mission in 1963. He's retired now, but he agreed to examine the watch if you're willing to meet with him. Margaret looked around the room at the three experts who were all focused on her response. The decision felt enormous. She could keep the watch private, sell it to a collector, or pursue this path that might reveal the complete truth about her grandfather's service. If I agree to go to Washington, Margaret asked, will I learn what really happened to Commander Mitchell? Webb and Dr. Chen exchanged glances before Webb answered. We can't promise complete answers. Many details from that era remain classified, but you'll learn more than anyone outside the military has ever known about that mission. Margaret thought about her grandfather's quiet life after the Navy. She remembered her mother mentioning nightmares and his reluctance to discuss his service. Perhaps learning the truth would help her understand the man who had raised her with such patient love. When would this meeting take place? She asked. Dr. Chen smiled. Colonel Hayes can arrange for you to visit next week. The Pentagon will cover your travel expenses, and you'll be given access to declassified records about the USS Nautilus operations. Margaret felt her heart pounding as she considered the magnitude of what they were offering. She would have the chance to step inside the world her grandfather had inhabited over 50 years ago. She might finally understand the experiences that had shaped the rest of his life. There's one more thing, Webb said quietly. The officer who agreed to meet with you served directly under Commander Mitchell. He's now a retired general, and he specifically requested to examine your grandfather's watch when he learned about its existence. Dr. Chen added, General Morrison rarely agrees to discuss his submarine service. The fact that he's willing to meet with you suggests this watch and your grandfather's story are more important than we initially realized. Margaret took a deep breath and made her decision. I'll go to Washington. I need to know what happened to my grandfather during that mission. As the experts began making arrangements for her trip, Margaret felt both excited and nervous about what she might discover. The quiet hardware store worker she had known as her grandfather was about to be revealed as someone entirely different. Someone who had been part of events that helped shape American military history. The watch had become a key that would unlock secrets that had been hidden for over half a century. Margaret stood outside the Pentagon building on a crisp Monday morning, clutching her purse that contained her grandfather's watch. The massive structure seemed to represent all the secrets and hidden stories of American military history. She felt small and nervous as she approached the security checkpoint. Colonel Patricia Hayes met her in the lobby after the lengthy security process. The colonel was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. She wore her uniform with the confidence of someone who had spent decades in military service. Ms. Thompson, thank you for making this journey, Colonel Hayes said as they walked through long corridors lined with photographs of military leaders. The people you're about to meet have been looking forward to this day for a very long time. They entered a conference room with a large wooden table surrounded by comfortable chairs. Several folders lay on the table, along with what appeared to be old photographs and documents. Margaret noticed that heavy curtains covered the windows, giving the room a serious and private atmosphere. Before the general arrives, Colonel Hayes explained, I want to prepare you for what you might hear today. Some of the information about your grandfather's mission has remained classified for over 50 years. We're sharing it with you because of your family connection and the historical importance of that watch. Margaret sat down and placed her purse on the table. I'm ready to hear whatever you can tell me. Colonel Hayes opened one of the folders and pulled out a map of the Arctic Ocean. Red lines marked various routes, and several locations were circled in different colors. In January 1963, The USS Nautilus was ordered to conduct a secret mission beneath the Arctic ice cap. The purpose was to test new equipment and gather intelligence about Soviet submarine activity in the region. She pointed to one of the circled areas on the map. 3 days into the mission, the submarine became trapped when shifting ice blocked their planned route to the surface. The crew found themselves in a dangerous situation with limited air supply and no way to communicate with the surface. Margaret listened intently as Colonel Hayes continued the story. The mission had been more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The submarine's nuclear reactor was functioning properly, but the crew needed to find a way to break through the ice or locate an open area where they could surface. That's where your grandfather came in, Colonel Hayes explained. Robert Thompson was part of a specialized diving team. These men were trained to leave the submarine underwater and perform repairs or reconnaissance in the most dangerous conditions imaginable. The door to the conference room opened, and Margaret heard footsteps approaching. She turned to see an elderly man in a crisp military uniform entering the room. Despite his age, he carried himself with the bearing of someone who had commanded respect throughout his career. Colonel Hayes immediately stood at attention. "General Morrison, sir. This is Margaret Thompson, Robert Thompson's granddaughter." General Morrison was a tall man with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes. He appeared to be in his 80s, but his movements were still precise and purposeful. When he saw the watch lying on the table, still wrapped in its purple velvet cloth, he stopped walking entirely. Margaret watched as all color drained from the general's face. His hands began to shake slightly, and he gripped the back of a chair to steady himself. For several long seconds, he simply stared at the watch without speaking. "I know this watch," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I know the man who wore it." General Morrison slowly approached the table and sat down across from Margaret. His eyes never left the watch as he spoke. "Commander James Mitchell was my closest friend and the finest officer I ever served with. That watch saved his life more than once during our underwater operations." Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes as she realized she was about to hear the complete story that her grandfather had never shared with anyone. The general's voice grew stronger as he began to tell the tale. When the Nautilus became trapped under the ice, Commander Mitchell volunteered to lead a diving team to the surface. The plan was to use explosives to create an opening large enough for the submarine to escape. He paused and looked directly at Margaret. "Your grandfather was part of that diving team." Robert Thompson was the most skilled diver on the entire submarine. Commander Mitchell specifically requested him for the mission because he trusted Robert with his life. Colonel Hayes added quietly, "The mission was incredibly dangerous. The divers had to swim up through freezing water, plant explosives on the ice above, and return to the submarine before the charges detonated." General Morrison continued the story with obvious emotion. "The first attempt failed. The ice was thicker than we had estimated. Commander Mitchell and your grandfather went up together for a second attempt, carrying more powerful explosives." Margaret leaned forward, completely absorbed in the story. She was finally learning about the experiences that had shaped her grandfather's life. "Something went wrong during the second dive," the general said, his voice growing quiet again. "Your grandfather returned to the submarine alone. He was exhausted and nearly unconscious from the cold. Commander Mitchell didn't come back." The room fell silent as Margaret processed this information. Her grandfather had witnessed the death of his commanding officer during one of the most dangerous missions of the Cold War. Robert told us that Commander Mitchell had been caught in an ice shift as they planted the explosives. General Morrison explained. "He tried to save him, but the current was too strong. Commander Mitchell gave Robert his watch and told him to make sure it got back to his family." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. She finally understood why her grandfather had never talked about his military service. He had carried the weight of losing his commander and friend for over 50 years. "Your grandfather completed the mission," the general continued. "The explosives worked on the second attempt. The Nautilus escaped and all remaining crew members survived. But Robert never got over losing Commander Mitchell." Colonel Hayes handed Margaret a tissue and spoke gently. "Your grandfather was recommended for several medals after that mission, but he declined them all. He said he was just doing his job." General Morrison reached across the table and carefully unwrapped the watch. "I haven't seen this timepiece in 60 years, he said with wonder. "Commander Mitchell wore it on every mission we undertook together." Margaret looked at the watch with completely new understanding. It wasn't just a valuable antique or a piece of military history. It was a memorial to friendship, sacrifice, and the kind of courage that most people never have to display. Now I understand why my grandfather kept this secret, Margaret said through her tears. He blamed himself for what happened to Commander Mitchell. The conference room remained silent for several minutes after General Morrison finished his story. Margaret held the watch in her hands, feeling the weight of 50 years of hidden grief and honor. She finally understood the quiet strength that had defined her grandfather throughout his life. He had carried the memory of Commander Mitchell's sacrifice without ever seeking recognition or sympathy. General Morrison wiped his eyes and looked at Margaret with deep respect. "Your grandfather was the bravest man I ever served with. He saved our entire submarine that day, but he never saw it that way. He only remembered the friend he couldn't save." Colonel Hayes opened another folder and pulled out several documents. "Ms. Thompson, we've prepared copies of the declassified mission reports for you to keep. These documents tell the complete story of what your grandfather accomplished during his service." Margaret accepted the papers with trembling hands. She thought about all the Sunday dinners and quiet conversations she had shared with her grandfather. He had been a hero to her in simple ways, but now she knew he had been a true hero in the most extraordinary circumstances. "General Morrison," Margaret said softly, "what should I do with this watch? I know it's valuable, but after hearing this story, I feel like it belongs somewhere special." The elderly general considered her question carefully. "That decision is entirely yours to make, but I can tell you what I think Commander Mitchell would have wanted. He was a man who believed deeply in education and remembering the sacrifices of those who serve." Colonel Hayes leaned forward with interest. "What are your thoughts, Margaret?" Margaret looked around the room at the military officers who had shared this incredible story with her. She thought about her grandfather's humble nature and his lifelong dedication to helping others quietly. She remembered how he had always taught her that the most important actions were often the ones nobody else noticed. "I want people to know about my grandfather and Commander Mitchell," Margaret said with growing conviction. "But I don't want to profit from their sacrifice. This watch represents something much more important than money." General Morrison smiled for the first time since entering the room. "What did you have in mind?" Margaret took a deep breath and made her decision. "I want to donate the watch to the Submarine Force Museum in Connecticut, but I want it displayed with the complete story of both men. I want visitors to understand that heroes don't always look like what we expect. Sometimes they're quiet hardware store workers who carry incredible secrets." Colonel Hayes nodded approvingly. The museum would be honored to receive such a donation. "And General Morrison, would you be willing to help us create an accurate historical display?" The general straightened in his chair with renewed energy. "I would consider it a privilege to help tell Robert and James's story properly." Margaret felt a sense of peace settling over her. The decision felt right in a way that selling the watch never could have. "I want the display to show that real courage isn't just about dramatic actions. It's also about carrying difficult memories with grace and living quietly with honor." Over the next hour, they discussed the details of how the display would be created. The museum would work with military historians to ensure complete accuracy. General Morrison would provide additional photographs and documents from his personal collection. Margaret would write a personal statement about her grandfather's character and values. "There's one more thing I'd like to suggest," General Morrison said as their meeting began to wind down. "I think we should try to locate Commander Mitchell's surviving family members. They deserve to know what happened to their loved one and how his sacrifice saved an entire submarine crew." Margaret felt excited by this possibility. "Do you think we can find them after all these years?" Colonel Hayes made notes on her pad. "The military keeps records of next of kin information. We should be able to trace his family tree and contact any living relatives. They might want to attend the museum dedication ceremony." As they prepared to leave, General Morrison stood and walked over to Margaret. He placed his hands gently on her shoulders and looked directly into her eyes. "Your grandfather would be proud of the decision you've made today. You've honored both his memory and Commander Mitchell's sacrifice in the most meaningful way possible." Margaret felt tears forming again, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than sadness. "Thank you for telling me the truth about what happened. I've spent my whole life wondering why he was such a special person. Now I understand." 3 months later, Margaret stood in the Submarine Force Museum surrounded by family members, veterans, and visitors from around the country. The new display case held her grandfather's watch alongside photographs of both Robert Thompson and Commander James Mitchell. A detailed explanation told the story of their Arctic mission and the friendship that had shaped both men's lives. Margaret had written a plaque that read, "In memory of Commander James Mitchell, who gave his life to save his crew, and Petty Officer Robert Thompson, who carried that sacrifice with honor for 50 years. True heroism lives quietly among us, recognized not by medals or ceremonies, but by the daily choice to serve others with dignity and love." General Morrison, now using a walking cane but still commanding in his presence, spoke at the dedication ceremony. He told the assembled crowd about the values that both men had represented and the importance of remembering the sacrifices made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Among the visitors that day were 3 members of Commander Mitchell's family, who had been located through military records. His nephew, now a grandfather himself, thanked Margaret with tears in his eyes for ensuring that his uncle's story would finally be told. As the ceremony concluded and visitors began examining the display more closely, Margaret stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. She thought about the $15 purchase that had changed her understanding of her family's history. The old watch had been dismissed by everyone at the estate sale. Just as her grandfather had lived his life without seeking attention or recognition, Margaret realized that the most valuable things in life were often the ones that appeared ordinary on the surface. Her grandfather had taught her that lesson through his quiet example, and now his story would teach the same lesson to thousands of museum visitors for years to come. The watch no longer belonged to her, but the legacy of courage, sacrifice, and humble service that it represented would remain in her family forever. Margaret had learned that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the honor of carrying forward the values of those who came before us. As she walked back into the museum, Margaret smiled at the sight of children pressing their faces against the display case, learning about heroes they never knew existed. Her grandfather's story would live on, inspiring new generations to serve quietly, love deeply, and carry their responsibilities with grace.